You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, breaking its Brexit farming promises, the government's plans for more sustainable farming are criticised by wildlife charities. And must try harder. The chair of the Climate Change Committee tells us that after COP26, the government needs to walk the talk on climate and match ambition with policy.
The real issue is when the rubber hits the road, when you actually get on with doing those things. And my job is to make sure that the government does those things.
As Delhi authorities close schools indefinitely due to dangerous levels of air pollution, we ask if we're taking the issue seriously enough. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, public money for public goods, that's the theory behind a post-Brexit subsidy scheme for farmers. And today the government took a step further in telling farmers how they'd be paid to improve the quality of their soil in order to both benefit biodiversity and mitigate against the effects of climate change. Because soil is crucially important, not only for growing crops and feeding livestock, but also because it's a huge carbon sink. And if soil isn't taken care of, the carbon is released and will add to the greenhouse gas emissions which cause global warming. So let's find out a bit more. Well, Sky's political correspondent Kate McCann joins me now from Westminster. So, Kate, tell us more about the plans and what the reaction has been to them.
Well, the Sustainable Farming Incentive will replace the Basic Payment Scheme. And essentially, the premise at the heart of this is that the government believes that it should be less prescriptive, that you should trust farmers to make some of these decisions, because they say, George Eustice says, that farmers will make better decisions when the value to them is increased, and ultimately those decisions lead to better outputs for climate change and the environment too. Now, examples of that are no-till farming, for example, where some farmers have found that doing that means that they don't have to use as many chemicals on their land, and ultimately it's far better for the soil. There's less erosion and they can reuse those fields more intensively. So the government is trying to push people, to nudge them, if you like, to make these choices rather than really prescriptively telling them or fining them if they don't. But campaigners say that the problem with that is that there will be gaps, because this new system at the moment focuses on soil. There are 3 main areas being announced today. The other areas will be announced later. So, for example, on hedgerows, those measures will come in 2023. On orchards, they will be in 2025. And campaigners say in the time between the old system and the new system, some farmers might exploit those gaps for short-term incentives. So they say that's unfair for farmers who want to use the scheme for good. Now, the government says, George Eustice, his family have been farming in Cornwall for 6 decades. He says that most farmers will make the right choices, that many already are, and this system trusts them to do that rather than penalising them.
Kate, thanks very much indeed. Now let's take a look at some of the day's other climate news. And schools and colleges have been ordered to close in India's capital city until further notice due to high levels of air pollution. Delhi's city government had reopened schools last week after closing them for 15 days because of poor air quality. A ban on construction will continue, and diesel trucks with non-essential goods are also barred from entering the city, while Delhi authorities have hired an extra 700 natural gas buses to encourage people to use public transport. Poverty, poor infrastructure and an over-reliance on rainfall are behind the famine in Madagascar, according to climate scientists. More than 1 million people are affected by serious hunger, according to the World Food Programme, who had described conditions in the south of the country as the world's first climate-induced famine. A report from World Weather Attribution concluded that Madagascar's worst drought in 4 decades has been caused by natural climate variability, with climate change only playing a small part. A period of global cooling triggered by volcanic activity may have caused one of the most severe mass extinctions in history. A new study looking at the effects of volcanic ash and lava on oceans found that 84% of ocean species were made extinct by the cooling event 450 million years ago. Researchers found 2 exceptionally large volcanic events coincided very closely with 2 peaks in glaciation and extinction. Now, UK efforts on climate change should focus on strengthening delivery of the net zero strategy rather than inflating the gap between ambition and implementation. That's the conclusion of the Climate Change Committee, the independent body set up to advise the government on climate policy. Well, in a post-COP assessment published today, they say that despite world-leading targets, the UK government still doesn't have the policies in place to support that ambition. Well, earlier I spoke to Lord Deben, chair of the Climate Change Committee, and started by asking him in which areas of policy the government is falling short.
It's got its programme, but it hasn't actually started many of those issues. So we've got to have much tougher building regulations for our homes. We've got to move on changing our heating arrangements. We've got to have a land use system, a way of helping farmers and landowners to use the land more effectively so that it can take the carbon out of the atmosphere and put it down in the soil and in trees. All that we've got to have much more clearly spelt out, and the government's starting on those programmes.
Well, yes, because the government would argue, wouldn't it, that it's one of the first countries in the world to set net zero into law. They would point out that they've got some of the most ambitious emissions targets in the world. And they also say they're one of the first countries to produce those detailed plans to meet net zero. Are you saying that's not fair?
No, that's absolutely true. And I would congratulate the government on doing that. But the real issue is when the rubber hits the road, when you actually get on with doing those things. And my job is to make sure that the government does those things. And at the moment, we don't have those detailed policies. We need to have those, and we need to have them actually under operation. This is not a criticism of the government. It's saying this now has to be done. And I'm looking to the government to do it. And the other thing it has to do, of course, is to complete its year as president of the COP26, because much of what will be the success of that has got to be achieved in the coming months. So it's got to give the backing to Alok Sharma, who has been a great success, to finish the job.
One of the areas that I think the CCC has raised as one of concern is this issue of fossil fuel subsidies. And leaders at COP26 agreed to phase out what was described as inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But this is a difficult issue, isn't it? The government here might argue that they need to manage the transition to renewables very carefully, not least for security of energy supply, but also because there are a huge number of jobs tied up in this area.
Yes, that's why it's got to be done properly. But the idea that you talk about efficient fuel subsidy seems to us to be quite nonsense. What we have to do is to recognise that we will need further fossil fuels between now and 2035, and some thereafter. But what the fuel industry has got to show is precisely how much they can already supply from their present sources. It's no good opening new sources unless there's a very good reason for it. And so far, we have seen no good reason.
What about individuals' behaviour? Would you like to see the government coming forward with advice for individuals on, say, how much they should fly or how much meat they should eat?
No, I much prefer the government to come forward with information for people so that they know how to make those choices. There are an awful lot of people out there who really do want to make the proper choice. And for example, on meat, yes, we ought to eat less meat, but we ought to eat better meat. And the best meat to eat is British produced meat because it has the lowest carbon footprint of any meat produced in the world. I'd like to see the government making sure that we don't import meat from countries where the carbon footprint is much greater and then undercut farmers producing that in this country. Our trade policy has got to be improved. There are a whole range of things the government can do without being dictatorial.
Do stay tuned. Coming up after the break, I'll be joined by the climate activist Daze Aghaji and author and journalist David Wallace-Wells. And we're going to be discussing if air pollution is being taken seriously enough and what the future of food could look like. Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with climate activist Daze Aghaji and the author and journalist David Wallace-Wells. So good to see you both. Good evening to you. And first of all, we're going to talk about air pollution because it's a deadly issue for people in countries around the world. And as we heard earlier, schools and colleges have again been closed in the Indian capital, New Delhi, due to poor air quality. And closer to home, there were protests in the Serbian capital, Belgrade, over air pollution just this week. It's Europe's most polluted big city, according to the European Environment Agency. For those forced to breathe in toxic air every day, it can seem that little's being done to address this issue. So let's talk about it a little bit more. David Wallace-Wells, this is something that you've written extensively about. So are we taking pollution seriously enough, do you think?
The short answer is absolutely not. It seems to me to be among the biggest public health and environmental crises of our time. In some ways, a bigger problem even than climate change. The mortality statistics are overwhelming. Most data suggests at least 7 million people, perhaps as many as 10 or more million people a year dying from air pollution, most of that from the burning of fossil fuels. That is an unfathomable amount of death and much more suffering besides. I think we're not doing nearly enough, in part because many of us living in places like the UK and the US don't regard the humanity of people living in places like India adequately, but also because we regard the status quo in which we ourselves in our relatively clean air are suffering as acceptable simply because it is the status quo, and don't think about what kind of a better, cleaner, healthier future we could be building, and then also a more prosperous one if we took the opportunity to more rapidly transition off of those deadly fuels and into a much greener, cleaner future.
And Daze, I can see you nodding there, and I think you've got some personal experience. You feel that you've been affected by pollution, don't you?
Oh, yes, I have. I have grown up in an area of where most kids in primary schools have asthma, and I grew up thinking that was totally normal, which it isn't. I'm living in an area where we have an incinerator, and we watch the incinerator burn over a community that's mostly populated by Black and brown people of working class backgrounds. This is the reality of air pollution. It's not just something that affects our health, but it affects our developmental stages. It affects communities as a whole. And the fact that it's allowed to be continued for so long is disgusting. In places like, for example, in Lewisham in London, it's 6 times over the legal levels of air pollution. It's literally illegal to breathe the air that we're breathing currently, and we are not even the worst. When is it going to be enough? When are enough people going to die for governments to care?
Well, yes, and that's interesting, isn't it? You quoted that figure from the World Health Organization, David, saying that around 7 million people die from air pollution annually. But as Daze pointed out, it's not just in some of those poorer developing countries. It is also in big, wealthy cities as well. So do you think that people are waking up to this? They're beginning to?
I think they're beginning to. A lot of the scariest research is now just a few years old, and it tends to take a little while for that kind of stuff to sort of circulate and percolate and begin to change public opinion and public policy. I do think the more we talk about it, the more we note it, the more alarmed we'll be. And I do think the research is going to continue moving very much in this direction. The World Health Organization just a couple months ago changed its threshold, the standard that it says is safe. They cut it in half, which means it used to be the case that 90% of the world was living in places with dangerously polluted air. Now it's something closer to 99%, which means almost nobody is safe. And in fact, the researchers doing that work say possibly even that safe threshold isn't safe. They just haven't really done the work yet on the lower levels of air pollution to know, but they suspect that as it was with lead pollution, no level of air pollution will be safe at all. And we'll still be seeing death from pollution, but also as Daze was pointing out, developmental problems, cognitive problems, behavioral problems, produced in part, at least, from this pollution, which is an elective problem. We could be burning much less fossil fuel. We could be burning much less farmland. These are choices we make in part through policy, which are killing at least 7, and the figures I trust are more like 10 million people a year, which is, again, just an absolutely staggering figure. It means 100 million deaths a decade. It means 400 million deaths in my lifetime. That is the kind of thing that we should be orienting an entire moral politics around, not one that we should be treating as an environmental afterthought.
OK, I'm going to move us on to our next subject now, because we've got a lot we want to squeeze in. And we're going to talk about how we farm, because it has a huge impact on the environment, whether it's soil degradation from growing crops or the emissions from flying produce around the world. So the future of farming and the food we eat is a big issue. And Daze, the government's announced today that farmers will be paid to look after England's soil, which is an important carbon store, of course. How important a moment is that? Is this a big step to making farming more sustainable?
I think it's a vital step. I don't think it's a big step. And I don't think it's big enough for the same government that calls themselves climate leaders every 2 seconds. I see that giving and empowering farmers to be able to farm their own land and to make sure it's regenerative in purpose is so important. But soil degradation definitely is important, but it's only one part of the farming system that has to change. We have to start looking away from monocultural farming that's causing issues within biodiversity and the soil in itself. We have to start looking at how do we build regeneration and into our farming systems. And that's really important, not just for the farmers and our environment, but also for the food we eat, for the nourishment we get. These are all things that will be greatly affected if we don't change the way that we farm.
Well, yes, and it's such a complex issue, isn't it, David? We can only touch on some of the issues, but not only has farming got a role to play in helping mitigate against climate change, protecting the soil being an example, but farming is also affected hugely by climate change, certainly in some parts of the world.
Yeah, I think most scientists believe that through direct temperature effects, most crops will see declines in their yields over the next few decades. You also have to deal with the fact that climate change is making pest infestation more common. It's making weather patterns more erratic, both in the case of droughts and heat waves, but also in the case of flooding, all of which can be devastating for crops. Last year in the U.S., American farmers made more money from insurance payouts than they did from actually selling their crops to the market. And when you think globally and how interconnected we are, how globalized our food system is, it's not really the case that for most parts of the world, a crop failure in one corner of the planet doesn't mean anything. It affects everything, even if it's not directly affecting the amount of food that we'll be having in a place like the US or the UK. It will affect food prices, which are going to be that is a difficult problem for those who are already living on the edge of hardship with food, or who have a hard time getting the food they need. As we've seen with so many other products over the last few months, the global supply chain is really fragile. The food supply chain is as fragile, and climate change is going to make it much harder to move that food around the world.
Sorry to cut in. I just want to give Daze one more answer on the issue of imported food. 80% of food in the UK is imported. I mean, that's going to have an impact in terms of air miles, but also some farms in other countries might have lower environmental standards. There are so many issues here, Daze, aren't there?
Exactly. And I think we have to remember, especially as an island, we are so vulnerable to the changes within food systems and the way imports come in. And I think we noticed that with COVID. So if we don't have the right soil, if we don't have the right processes to grow food at home as well, in order to meet the demands, what happens if there is another shortage? Where does that leave us? Where does that leave the average person? Where does that leave the people who are most marginalized in society?
OK. Daze, Aghaji, David, Wallace-Wells, thank you so much. Dealing with very big issues in rather a small amount of time. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we are all done for the evening, but do stay tuned here for Sky News tonight, because Sky News goes inside the lab studying the new COVID-19 variant. But that's it from me. Do stay tuned. Lots coming up again tomorrow. See you next time.